This man murdered his girlfriend and then died of a heart attack while he was burying her. In May 2022, locals rang police after they noticed a man unresponsive in his garden. Police in South Carolina raced to the scene and they found the body of 60-year-old Joseph McKinnon. He was found lying next to a big hole in the ground that he'd been digging. It also became apparent that his girlfriend Patricia was missing. Now, police tried and failed to get hold of her and then eventually found blood in the pair's home. When they questioned her work colleagues, it turned out that she hadn't turned up to work that day, and that was extremely unusual. When police did some further digging into the case, they discovered that actually the hole that Joseph was digging was a grave for Patricia. Joseph had attacked her and then wrapped her body up in bin bags. After killing her, he'd had a heart attack while trying to conceal her body.
Nothing could have prepared me for the end of this story. So when I was little, I used to always complain about a scratching noise coming from the room next to me. My dad actually converted the guest bedroom next to my room into a home office, and I was never allowed in there. He was a really busy man. One night, I was laying in bed, unable to sleep, when I thought I heard a small sob come from his office. I could faintly make out the sound of a woman crying, but I knew I wasn't allowed to go in there. And honestly, at that point, I was kind of too afraid to anyways. The next day, I told my dad what I had heard, and he told me it was probably just a bad dream. But that didn't make any sense to me because I knew what I had heard. My dad spent the entire day in his office that day. I didn't see him come out once. The next night, I waited until my father was asleep, and I did what I knew I shouldn't do. I went into his office. And when I opened the door, there were no books. There was no desk. There wasn't even a single chair. Just scratched into the walls a million times. Help me.
These are 3 California creatures you never heard about. Up first is the Dark Watchers, and they're usually sighted in the mountains of California, and are described as tall, featureless, dark silhouettes, often wearing brimmed hats and having walking sticks. If you ever see a Dark Watcher, whatever you do, never approach it, because if you do, you will completely vanish forever. Next is Tahoe Tessie, who is a water creature and is living in Lake Tahoe. It's been described as having smooth skin, and is apparently so big it's the size of a bus. So next time you go to Lake Tahoe, you better look around for Tahoe Tessie. Finally is the Lone Pine Devil. This is also a creature who is often sighted in the mountains of California, and it's described as a large creature with both bird and reptile qualities. They have razor-sharp claws and venomous fangs. So what creature do you think the creepiest is? In my opinion, it has to be the Dark Watchers just because of how creepy and weird they sound. But either way, let me know which one is the scariest to you. Whatever you do, do not look into her eyes.
My father locked me in our basement for 11 days and claimed not to know I was there. My name is Charles Bothwell V. I was 12 years old in 2014 when my father, Charles Bothwell IV, still had custody of me and mistreated me. In June 2014, my father reported me missing. The police conducted an intensive search, but eventually I was found hidden in the basement of the family home, approximately 11 days after being reported missing. I lived in inhumane conditions. My parents deprived me of food, subjected me to repeated abuse and violence, and cut me off from all social contact. My father even pleaded for public assistance on television during my supposed disappearance, while he himself was the perpetrator. The case took a shocking turn when investigators discovered that my father was aware of my presence in the basement. Both my father and mother were arrested and charged with severe parental neglect. Investigators also found evidence of abuse against me. I was subsequently placed under the custody of Child Protective Services. My father was then sentenced to 18 months probation and ordered to take anger classes, and he will no longer be allowed to approach or contact me.
I threw my baby from the 4th floor. My name is Sonia Hermosillo, and I was 42 years old in 2011 when I committed the worst act. I had 3 children, including 2 little girls, and my baby Noah Medina, a 7-month-old boy with autism. My husband and my daughter had already noticed that since the birth of my son Noah, I had a different behavior. His illness and various health problems, such as the flat head that required him to wear a helmet all the time, had particularly affected me, and I often neglected the way I took care of him. That's why my husband decided not to leave me alone with our baby, but I took advantage of the fact that he was in the shower to take him and leave with him. That day, he was supposed to undergo tests at the hospital, so I drove there, and once I arrived, I parked on the 4th floor of the parking lot. Once out of the car, I thought that throwing him from the top of the 4 floors might be a good idea to see if he could survive. So I took him, removed the helmet he was supposed to wear, and threw him, and he died instantly. I was quickly arrested by the police. Once arrested, I said that all of this was due to mental problems. I confessed to the police that I killed him because of the problems he had. I was then sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole.
This is the time I was almost abducted by a serial killer. In February of 2012, I went to go visit my grandfather's grave for his birthday. His death was a pretty hard thing for me to process, as he only died in March of 2011, so it was all still pretty new to me. I was kneeling in front of his grave, crying and thinking to myself, when all of a sudden I looked up and see a man running at me full speed from the woods in front of me. I was able to get myself to my truck pretty quickly before he got to me, but by the time I got in the truck, he was only about 50 feet away. I got in my car before he could get to me and locked the doors, much to his displeasure. He threw his hands up as if he had lost a football game. I started my truck and started driving out as fast as I could, but not before I passed him. I didn't break eye contact with him the entire time I was driving past, so I got a really good look at him. So cut to a few years later, I'm pretty bored at work, so I download this random app that has a bunch of paranormal, UFO, cryptid, and serial killer stories on it. And as I'm browsing through stories, I come across one that makes my heart absolutely drop. There was a photo of a man I recognized very well, Israel Keys, who was most known for murdering an underage girl in Alaska, dismembering her, and throwing the pieces of her body in a lake. He would bury kill kits in places long before he ever committed the crimes. He had been killing for a few years, to the point where no one really knew what his actual death toll was. And he would eventually go on to take his own life in prison. At the end of this book I read about him, they mentioned his favorite places to abduct people: public parks and cemeteries. I often wonder if he left any kill kits in that cemetery. You were fast, Israel, but I was faster.
This abandoned prison is straight out of a nightmare. Welcome to the Mid-Orange Correctional Facility in Warwick, New York. Originally opened as a reform school for boys, this sprawling complex was eventually turned into a prison for men. And over the years, it housed a number of deplorable criminals from New York State, including an infamous serial killer. As you walk the halls of this crumbling complex, you can feel the energy, you can feel the souls reaching out to try to talk to you. One of the more infamous spirits that haunts this property is that of a teenager named Jimmy. Obviously, back when this was a reform school for boys, abuse was rampant in these halls. And one teenager named Jimmy decided to take his own life by hanging himself in one of the buildings out back. Now, I can tell you from first-hand experience that this place is definitely haunted. I spent the night there ghost hunting while filming an episode of my show with the New York Post, which is available on YouTube now. And you could just feel the energy of these buildings emanating. I mean, there were a number of crazy historical things that happened here in these buildings, including a riot, and obviously tons of people lost their lives here over the years. I mean, the Mid-Orange Correctional Facility was known as one of the most violent prisons in the state of New York. And every single part of this complex is haunted, including this eerie church that was left abandoned after the building was closed. When this building sat empty for years, rituals were performed by people that broke in here, and the dark energy from these rituals still remains. If you want to see the full video that I filmed here, just head to the New York Post's YouTube channel, and for more spooky content, follow me on YouTube at The Paranormal Files.
This baby was kidnapped, and then the parents received the wrong baby back. In April 1964, Dora Fronzak gave birth to baby Paul. Although this should have been one of the happiest days of her life, it soon escalated into a nightmare. Paul was kidnapped. A woman posed as a nurse, and using her fake profession, she managed to steal Paul from the Chicago hospital. Word spread that the baby was missing, and 600 homes were frantically searched. Paul's parents made devastating pleas for his return. Now, police only had Paul's ear shape and blood type to go off. However, they did soon find an abandoned child in New Jersey. When Dora saw him, she was incredibly relieved. She had baby Paul back, and that would be the last of it for 10 years. One Christmas, when he was hunting for presents, 10-year-old Paul discovered a memory box, and inside this box were news clippings from his kidnapping. When he confronted his mum about this, she shut the conversation down, but it stayed in the back of his mind. Paul started to have doubts about his true history. In 2012, he did a DNA test, and the results shocked everyone. Paul was not the Paul who'd been kidnapped. He wasn't biologically related to either of his parents. Now, sadly, his parents were actually furious at Paul, and they refused to speak to him for a year. In 2015, Paul discovered that he was actually born as Jack, and he had a twin sister, Jill. His biological mum had a drinking problem, and his dad was a violent man. Meanwhile, the FBI ended up reopening the case of missing baby Paul. It was actually another home DNA test that revealed where he was. A man named Kevin Beatty was actually missing baby Paul. Now, the woman who raised him had actually passed away, so some mystery still remains about missing baby Paul. Tragically, in 2019, Dora actually arranged to meet her long-lost son, Kevin. However, before the pair could reunite, Kevin actually died of cancer. Paul's twin sister Jill is still missing. He continues to look for her, and you could actually help solve this cold case. By taking home DNA tests and uploading your information onto gedmatch.com, we can all help to solve cold cases.
This is the backpacking beheadings, the tragic case of Louise Jesperson and Marie Newlin. Before Louise Jesperson and Marie Newlin embarked on their journey to Morocco, Louise posted on Facebook letting her friends know she would be making a trip to Morocco and was asking anyone out there if they knew about Mount Tubkul, and the theory is this post put the attackers on high alert, and apparently how the girls would become targets of the attackers. Nobody knows how true this is, but it's the leading theory. But the girls continued on their journey, and eventually as night fell, they set up camp to rest. During their hike, it's believed the attackers were stalking their victims, waiting for them to stop, waiting for them to get further away from civilization, and once this happened, the attacks ensued. The attack was brutal, and both Louise and Maureen were brutally beheaded, and some reports even claim the girls were sexually assaulted. The murder of Louise Jesperson was recorded and posted online. It's believed Marie Newlin was murdered first, but there's no video of that, though people online claim it's out there. The video starts with Louise Jesperson lying on her stomach, and she's wearing a t-shirt and underwear. And almost immediately, the terrorist attempts to behead her. But he starts from the back of the neck, and that usually isn't the way to do it. Right when he cuts, Louise says ow and begins to scream, and apparently in her native language she was begging for her mother. Once the man beheading her realizes it's hard to behead someone from behind, he then turns her over, and one of the people he was with stomps on her face to hold her down, and he then starts beheading her from the neck. And at this point, there's a lot of blood and a lot of screaming and gurgling. He then begins hacking at her neck to complete the beheading, and once he's beheaded Louise Jesperson, he picks up her head and takes it to her tent and places it inside, and the video concludes. It's a quick video, but it's extremely bloody, extremely horrible, and extremely sad. It's definitely one of the worst beheadings I ever covered, mainly because these girls were very young, very naive, and didn't deserve what happened to them at all. One of the girls even posted how the world is safe and that we shouldn't judge people, and it's super sad that they paid the price of this with their life. Please don't go looking for this video because it will stick with you forever and it's really not worth it. Rest in peace to Louise Jesperson and Marie Newlin.
This is one of the most dangerous men in Canadian history, Shane Pattinson. And while he doesn't really look it on the outside, he really is a dangerous and twisted man. So in 2012, Shane was sentenced to 5 years in prison because he had collected over 4,500 CP images depicting the extreme essay of young girls under the age of 5. 4,500 images. So he served most of his prison sentence and he was released in 2015 and was immediately sent to a halfway house with the Salvation Army. But just shortly after getting out of prison, when he went to the halfway house, investigators performed a routine check-in on him, and what they found was extremely shocking. When investigators checked in on Shane, they walked into the room, they found him naked from the waist down. He had 3 devices open, each of them displaying CP images, and he was actively toying with himself at the time that they walked in to these images. When these investigators performed searches on what Shane had in his room, they discovered that in the short time he was out from prison, he had already accrued thousands of additional CP images and was actively sharing them with other users across the internet. This means that he served his first sentence for CP possession. He got out and almost immediately went back to collecting it and obsessing over it. And like I said before, this guy had thousands of victims across the planet, and he was working his way into the dark web to connect with other pedophiles across the world. Now, Shane has a pretty disturbing life story. When he was only 3 years old, he allegedly played mommy and daddy with a 4-year-old cousin of his, a game which turned graphic, if you know what I mean. He then stated that his great-grandfather sexually abused him for years until he hit puberty. And he said that he first started viewing CP images when he was only 14 years old. He also stated that when he was just 14 years old, he SA'd an 8-year-old friend of his sister's. He also told interviewers that he was intensely aroused by smelling women's undergarments and by sniffing dirty, soiled diapers. So he was eventually sentenced to 7 years in prison, but with his time served, he was actually only given 5.5 years. And this happened back in 2018, which means, if it all worked out in his favor, this year, Shane Patterson will be released from prison. And after reading this dude's story and learning about what he does, I do not think that he's going to be able to live in a normal society. I don't know how or why he's being released so quickly, but I'm just really afraid for what's going to happen when he's out next.
What? Nothing there, mate. Nothing there. What? There's nothing there.
This is the 10 days of horror that shocked Pennsylvania. On the 5th of July 2017, Jimmy Patrick left his house. He was a student living with his grandparents, and he was going to Cosmo DiNardo's house to buy marijuana. Cosmo had a history of schizophrenia and had been sectioned the year prior. He was known to police and had been arrested for possessing a gun. Now, this was illegal due to his mental health issues. Jimmy got to Cosmo's house, which was in a remote location. As he got out of the car, Cosmo shot him. He then dug a hole and buried him. The following day, when Jimmy never came home, his granddad reported him missing. Meanwhile, Cosmo was planning other drug deals. He agreed to meet with another student, 19-year-old Dean Finocchiaro. Before picking up Dean, he picked up his cousin, Sean Kratz. Now, Sean was also known to police, and he had many arrests due to theft and robbery. The pair decided to rob Dean instead of selling him substances. Again, Dean was shot and killed at the farmland. They wrapped him in tarp and put him in a metal tank. The same day, Cosmo met Thomas Mio and Mark Sturgis while his cousin stayed at the property. When they got back, Cosmo shot Thomas as he got out of the truck and he fell to the ground. Mark tried to sprint away, but Cosmo shot him and killed him. Cosmo then ran over Thomas with his truck, crushing him to death. He put the two bodies in the metal tank and poured petrol over them and set them alight. That evening and the following day, more of the parents reported their sons missing. Cosmo then contacted somebody in order to sell them Thomas's car. Meanwhile, however, police were tracking the cars of the missing boys. They found Thomas's car at Cosmo's family home. Cosmo was questioned but lied his way out of this. On day 6 of the investigation, police tracked one of the missing boys' phones to Cosmo's family home. Cosmo was arrested on firearms charges and his bail was set to $1 million. His dad actually paid 10% of this in cash and Cosmo was free. Police then managed to rearrest Cosmo because of the fact that he tried to sell a missing boy's car. Shortly after, police discovered the bodies of 3 of the boys on the property. Cosmo confessed to police and then told them where to find Jimmy's body. He got 4 consecutive life sentences and his cousin Sean got life in prison plus 18 to 36 years.
On March 17th in Pensacola, Florida, bridge worker Mason Ponder came across an unusually heavy suitcase. He had no idea that it contained the body of Gannon. Here's his testimony in court.
I was the first one to unzip it. And before we opened it, as soon as we unzipped it, we immediately noticed the smell. That's what hit us first. I remember looking up at Matt, who's quite a bit taller than me. And I said, Matt, I think there's something dead in here. And unfortunately, we do come across, sometimes somebody will throw out a litter of puppies or something in a bag. And, that's not uncommon. And it smelled, but it was so strong. It was different that day. So I didn't initially open it, and we kind of thought about what we were going to do first. When we finally went ahead and unzipped the rest of it, the smell was so overpowering. We kind of took a step back, and the first thing I remember seeing was just 2 little feet, and that had little football socks on them. The best I remember, I remember there being little socks on them. And before anything else happened, we couldn't really make out what it was. Matt dumped the suitcase over, and of course we initially immediately knew it was a body. But after looking at it, it was we couldn't tell male or female, boy or girl. We didn't know. A lot of black hair.
Gannon's autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the head, a gunshot wound to his jaw, and 12 separate stab wounds. This 11-year-old boy had suffered horrifically at the hands of his evil stepmother. Letitia was charged with the murder of Gannon and faces a total of 13 charges, including first-degree murder, child abuse causing death, and tampering with evidence. In 2022, Letitia changed her plea from guilty to not guilty by reason of insanity, stating that she was insane at the time of Gannon's murder. This delayed the start of a trial because she had to be evaluated multiple times to determine the state of her mental health. In March 2023, the jury was selected, and Letitia's defence claimed that the latest sanity report showed her to be insane at the time of Gannon's murder, claiming that she suffered a major psychotic crack at the time of the brutal killing. The state, however, have argued that the fact she tried to cover the crime up so well and throw off the police shows that she knew right from wrong. The trial continues, and you can follow it live over on Law and Crime. Pure evil or mentally ill? In 2012, when Zachary Davis was just 15 years old, he entered his mother's bedroom in the dead of night and struck her over the head 20 times with a sledgehammer.
Did you kill your mother?
Yeah.
And why did you kill her?
She wasn't taking care of my family.
And where did you hit her?
In the head.
Where was she when you did this?
She was asleep.
You've got a sledgehammer in one hand, and you open that door. What's going through your head at that moment?
My mind was pretty much blank. I could just hear the hammer hitting her head.
And what did it sound like?
It was this wet, thumping sound.
Zachary was a very quiet child. He lived with his parents and his older brother Josh, but when he was just 9 years old, his dad died from Lou Gehrig's disease, and it sent Zachary into a downward spiral. He was seen by a psychiatrist and diagnosed with schizophrenia and depressive disorder, and he started therapy. During therapy, Zachary went through the first 2 phases common in the bereavement process, numbness and depression, but he never made it to the third, recovery. His mother Melanie pulled him out of therapy after just 4 sessions and moved the family to Tennessee, thinking that they were starting a new life. Melanie worked as a paralegal and tried her best to provide a life for her 2 boys, but Zachary was becoming more and more withdrawn. By the time Zachary was 15, he was a complete outcast at school. He often spoke in whispers and wore the same hoodie every day, pulled up around his face. He had an app on his phone about serial killers and another listed torture devices. Zachary showed absolutely no signs of violence outwardly, but beneath the surface, something awful was bubbling. August 10th, 2012 was like any other day. Zachary, his brother and his mum went to watch a movie, and then when they got home, Melanie went up to bed. Once Zachary was sure that his mum was asleep, and after his brother had also gone to bed, he grabbed a sledgehammer from the basement, went into his mother's room, and started hitting her over the head, again and again, 20 times in total. Melanie actually woke up after the first blow and started gasping for air. She then started to experience seizures while her son hit her over the head again and again until he was sure she was dead. He then went to the family's game room where he doused it in petrol and whiskey and set it on fire, intending to kill his brother Josh. The only problem was that he'd shut the door to the game room and the fire didn't spread as quickly as he'd hoped. Josh escaped and went to a neighbour's house. Zachary was found 10 miles from home, and on his arrest he said, "I didn't feel anything when I killed her." Zachary's trial for the murder of his mother began, and when he was asked if he could go back in time, would he do it again, he smirked and said, "Yes, and I'd kill Josh with the sledgehammer too." Zachary showed absolutely zero remorse in the courtroom, but his defence argued that he'd been hearing his father's voice and had been told to kill his mother. His grandma also testified, that he hadn't got the help that he needed as he was mentally ill, and he's not a monster, he's a child that made a terrible mistake. But after hearing from Zachary himself, the jury weren't so compassionate. He laughed when he described how heavy the murder weapon was, and took joy in describing the sound it made when it hit his mother's head. He was asked why he'd hit her so many times, and his response was, "I wanted to make sure she was dead." The jury deliberated for just 3 hours before reaching a guilty verdict. Zachary was sentenced to life with a minimum of 51 years, meaning he'll be in his mid-60s when he's eligible for parole.
Imagine getting married only to be decapitated by your husband 3 months later. 21-year-old couple Jared and Angie got married in October 2022. Around 4 p.m. on the 11th of January, police were called to their home in Texas. Police made a grim discovery in the pair's bathroom after finding, quote, what appeared to be the head of the victim to be in the shower, end quote. Angie's body was discovered on the floor near the bed in a pool of blood with multiple stab wounds to her back. It was actually Jared's poor parents that initially made this discovery after entering the home. They then obviously alerted police to what they found. Jared was arrested and has confessed to killing his wife with a kitchen knife. Jared was actually captured on CCTV, casually stealing a bottle of beer from Angie's workplace just minutes after it's believed that he killed her. Angie's friends have reported to police that the couple's relationship was toxic and Jared was very controlling. Jared's bond is currently set at $500,000. This schoolboy stabbed his teacher to death in front of a classroom full of students. 61-year-old Anne McGuire was a Spanish teacher teaching in Leeds. She'd actually worked at the school for 40 years and she was only 5 months off retirement. However, in April 2014, something absolutely horrific happened. One of her students was 15-year-old Will Cornick. He'd always been described as a smart student who never really caused any trouble. Classmates regarded him as a polite student, but after he got diagnosed with diabetes, his personality seemed to change. In 2013, he tried to join the army, but because of his diagnosis, he was rejected. Being in the army had been his dream, so this was really upsetting for him. After failing to complete his Spanish homework, he was given detention by Anne. He also expressed a wish to her that he wanted to drop Spanish, but she wouldn't let him, which only angered him more. He began to develop a deep-rooted grudge against Anne. Shockingly, he reportedly messaged his friends on Facebook asking if one of them would kill her for him for £10. During one school day, halfway through his Spanish class, Will decided to get up and attack Anne with a knife. The classmates watched on in horror as he chased her out of the classroom. When there, another teacher heard her screams and tried to shield Anne from any more blows from him. Will then allegedly returned to his class and told his classmates how it was a shame that he hadn't killed her. However, Anne did actually pass away from her injuries. Will later admitted that he did plan also to kill 2 other teachers. One of them was actually pregnant at the time. He's been sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 20 years. This is one of the most horrific cases I've heard recently, so please be warned before watching. 29-year-old Taylor Parker has just been sentenced to death for a crime so horrendous that I can't believe a human is capable of this. Regan Simmons Hancock and Taylor had met online. Their online friendship soon blossomed into a real-life connection. It was 2022 and Regan was married with a young daughter. She was also 8 months pregnant at this time. Taylor was also pregnant, or so it would seem to the outside world. She was posting pregnancy pictures on social media and even hosted a gender reveal party. Little did her loved ones know that she was actually staging the entire thing. Regan and Taylor were really good friends around this time and they were bonding over their pregnancies. Regan even shared a Facebook status thanking Taylor for bringing her round a gift and Starbucks. This was the day before she would be murdered by Taylor. On Taylor's supposed due date, she made her way round to Regan's house in Texas. Shortly after, Regan's mum made a horrifying discovery. Her daughter was face down on the floor, deceased with blood everywhere. Her mum rang the emergency services and they raced to the scene. It became apparent that her baby had been, and again, a massive trigger warning here, ripped out of her stomach, and Regan had been stabbed over 100 times. Meanwhile, Taylor was pulled over for speeding and driving erratically. She'd actually put the baby in her lap with the umbilical cord coming out of her trousers to make it seem like she'd just given birth. When the pair were taken to hospital, the horrors of what actually happened became apparent. The newborn baby tragically passed away and Taylor was arrested. She was sentenced to death, but her defense lawyer said that her loved ones should have done more to protect her earlier on when she was pretending to be pregnant.